It was already the second half of the 80s that things had started. But, and lots were not taken seriously. And we have to remember in the early 80s, there was this show in Cologne called Westkunst, which explicitly stated that art was only possible between Western Germany and New York, if I would kind of provocatively formulate it. And there was this strong American dominance, and like seeing America and some Western European situations on the right level of art. As an Austrian, I was in a very specific situation because in the 80s, Austria needed. In the 80s, Austria was not yet really part of this Western art community. Austria was a country in between. Austria was in some ways, with its institutions, with a lot of situations, backwards in a certain sense. The Western European and American art was not as present in Austria as it has been already years before in Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, etc. These things were also not so much seen in Austria or seen its relevance in Austria. There were only very little idols in Austria, like for example Galerie next St. Stephan in Vienna. In this situation then the Ludwig Foundation, the coming of the Ludwig Foundation to Austria was very similar than the Ludwig Foundation in some Eastern European countries. It was very controversial and was very much about how Austrian art reacts on this kind of Western presence. So it was very much a Cold War phenomenon, even more complex in a way that and which was, from my personal perception, the one in Austria of my generation, a very unique situation, that of course there was a presence of Eastern European intellectuals in Vienna in the 60s and 70s, which was, or more in the 70s, which was very strong. A strong Czech representation, mainly writers, actors, etc., because of the Prague Spring. There was an Austrian intellectuality which would in some ways go back to the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire in a certain way. So there was a presence of Eastern European things which was determined culturally and historically, but which also was not comparable to recent tendencies in Western European and American art. So there were different worlds. So me personally, and most of all of the people we were among with, we were interested, of course, in America and Western Europe, and in the early 80s not at all interested what was happening beyond the Iron Curtain. And but that was one line, and for me then there were certain very important activity in Austria concerning the East was the Wilfried Schreiner at the Neue Galerie in Graz, the Graz Steirische Herbst, and the Neue Galerie had a series of exhibitions called Trigon, and involving Yugoslavian artists was very important in these days. Of course, Yugoslavian artists, as they could travel much easier, were much more present in Western situations, or were a little bit present in Western situations. And Western artists would show on and off in Yugoslavia. How they would also show on and off in Poland with Svoksal and the museum in Łódź. And Schreiner succeeded to do a show of Austrian art in Budapest in 85. And that was a kind of unique situation that Hungary was allowing uncensored to show Austrian art. And actually I was going there for the opening. And for me it was this strange situation, having traveled before very, very often to Germany, and speaking in Germany, of course, the same language, but especially in the Rhineland, being confronted with a different culture. And Hungary, walking on the streets in Budapest, was just the opposite experience for me. A very close culture and a completely different language and a completely different political situation. So that's what I consider to be very interesting. And and I also understood in these days already, and it was also the theory of Harald Seemann, even already in these days, that Vienna was anticipating bigger changes in Eastern Europe. So the Renaissance of Vienna, we have to imagine Vienna until within the 70s was very, very backwards as a city, as a public civil society, whatever. And Austria went in the late 70s through a big changes and a big renovation of society. Today it's very much seen as the period of Bruno Kreisky. And in this situation, Vienna opened up with the beginning of the 80s. It was the subway was built in Vienna. Suddenly the center of Vienna was accessible for a lot more people from the fringes of the city. The city changed in its, like how it functioned. And there was suddenly a community which was much more public than the underground communities of the 60s. Actually, the 70s were pretty bad society in Vienna. In the 70s there was a lot of youth culture, arena and such things, which, but there was the official arts culture was rather, I would say, in exile. People that went to Berlin, that worked mainly in Germany. And so that's, and these things, they kind of started to focus in the early 80s, and was a wonderful moment for the gallery. There were kind of these young artists, students of the academy. The Angewandte was very strong. There was suddenly internationality was a question, which has not been before. Before it was sentimentality for the 19th century, for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for all these things.
And you opened your gallery in 1981?
81, yeah.
And what was the reason that you decided to open a gallery? Because you worked for...
Yeah, before I worked for the Forum Stadtpark.
Public institutions.
I was working as an artist myself. I worked for the Forum Stadtpark in Graz, for the Steirische Herbstfestival. Actually, I had an offer by Wilfried Schreiner to work for him, which didn't interest me then. And I understood that public institutions were very immobile at the situation. The budgets were low. Then there was still not a big international view on the whole situation. It was still very, very local, regional, in some ways traditional, strongly politically influenced. And the museums still were very much under the control of the ministries. At this moment, an institution like the Secession was in shambles, hardly functioned. And so it was, and also I saw the limits with the Forum Stadtpark, like having difficulties to do a show with Wally Export. The ministry telling me in some ways I should not have having done the show, having done it with a meager support by the ministry, and I heard afterwards that they were not happy that I did this show, and they should have done another show, and such things. So there was still a kind of censorship in the heads, at least, of the bureaucrats, and so it was still a kind of repressive situation, an immobile situation, and so there was not so much the chance to do big things as one always wants at this situation.
But you could do it in your private gallery.
Yeah, and then I had a little bit of money out of a heritage, and I started, and it was the luck to find this wonderful space in the center, and the support of a lot of young artists, and all these things came together. And this was a situation which was pretty unique, and there was a certain energy in the city, and I was lucky to be able to pick up this energy.
I heard once that at time when you started with the gallery spaces were really a space for experimentation. So it was not meant in the first point of view that you're doing exhibition for selling. It was really a place where artists could fail, test out, and so on. Is that right?
But it was impossible to sell anything anyway. Yeah, it was still out of my own artist praxis, as well as out of the whole setting also, of like how the artist wanted to work and so on. The gallery, of course, was a place of experimentation, and it was a place that created a certain community. And I think that's both. And in this way, it was also interesting to do the international work. It was, I think, it was important to the artists that they had the same space as other very famous international artists, so they could compare their work in the same conditions with these other things. And so that, in this way, such a situation was unique. They're very rare situations, and I think galleries, there is this kind of type of gallery which comes together with historic coincidences and the right group of people, artists and the people who run the gallery, and which is at the same time, I think Hetzler in Cologne was, and it was very close to me, was something similar, where you could, or maybe Metro Pictures in New York, where you could, the artists between themselves would communicate very strongly. It was kind of curiosity between the artists, and to understand that there was a space that they could use together. And in this way, it was also a great coincidence, the interest of the German artists in the city of Vienna. It was like a big discovery of people like Martin Kippenberger or Albert Oehlen to discover this city, which was German-speaking, but was again different in culture, which was like a big contrast to the German cities, which had a big historic...
How does one discover a city like Vienna if you're Martin Kippenberger?
His sister describes it pretty well in the biography. That was in the nature of Martin Kippenberger to discover cities, and he would conquer cities, and in Vienna was perfect for him because he could speak in his own tongue, and he would really, it was a communication machine, and with a big consciousness how a city functions and which restaurants and which fabric was productive, but this was also then a big exchange between artists, and
also Dieter Roth was at the time in Vienna, so there was this kind of exchange.
It was on with one or two generations older. Dieter Roth was strongly in contact with the actionists, and also Vienna was, of course, a fabulous citizen because it still had this 19th century frame, and it was this time moving. It was rather cheap, and and in some ways the opening of Vienna definitely was an anticipation of the whole Eastern European momentum that followed 10 years later.
So before that moment of 1989, you already did work with artists from
this Budapest
1985
visit, 85, created a certain curiosity.
And you traveled quite a bit.
Yeah, and then there was also a show. I don't know when it was exactly. There was a show that we did maybe that was later, that we did in Belgrade. But there was first contacts to former Yugoslavia. Then there were. And then it was a very important moment for me was the exhibition of Ilya Kabakov in Bern at the Kunsthalle, which worked through political channels. There was this Swiss politician Barrioles, who was the president of the Kunsthalle. He met Kabakov on a visit to Moscow and realized that there was something very exciting going on. He took the next time Jean-Hubert Martin, the director of the Kunsthalle, who was also one of the early guys to
Jean-Christophe Amann.
No, Jean-Hubert Martin, who later was in the Pompidou.
Okay, yes.
And he was one of the early guys to look into Eastern Europe, as generally the French have done already in the 70s. They had to see that like Polish artists or Czech artists have been present in France also in the 70s. But again, back to Jean-Hubert Bermatin made a show with Kavakov, which was very important. I only knew the catalog, I have not seen the show, but this was important to me and made me visit Moscow. I was curating at this time for the Steirische Herbst and the Grazer Kunstverein a show on literature and art. And so Kavakov was super interesting. And this was, of course, a kind of revelation to get into the city where you. It was the same summer as Chernobyl had happened. Gorbachev was in his first year, and it was not yet clear if what Gorbachev would bring. The interpretation were very different. Some would say it would become a neo-Stalinist politician. Some would say there could be reform. It was kind of the big question around what's going to happen. For an external visitor, you immediately realized about the, I would say, decadency or that the Soviet system didn't function anymore. The most impressive part of it, Kavakov gave me an incredible tour within 2 days through the Moscow art situation. And there was this incredible thing that they was this artist group of kindergarten, which was rather in the center of Moscow, and which was a place of complete anarchy and public visible anarchy, like 10 minutes away from the Kremlin. So you had this kind of big contradiction of this image of a Kremlin, which for the Westerner in these days was incredibly powerful and Kafkaesque, and you had these black cars leaving the Kremlin every 10 minutes. It was like really, and then 10 minutes away you had this young artists more or less doing what they wanted, and so that was a super interesting contradiction, and also of course it was incredibly interesting to, as a visitor, to be confronted with this very different system. And again, being lucky with Kavakov, having had this incredible guide through this whole system, because he would, with his own wit and with his own very specific way to translate things. Also, he hardly spoke German, so it was very kind of interesting how we communicated, but still it was one additional level in communication, and it was the young artists as well as the artists of his generation, so one would get an incredibly broad view within a very short time about a completely different intellectual constellation.
So you showed him in the gallery?
No, I did not show him. It was actually for Graz, and then there was trying to invite him for a grant, because of course he was not eligible and not able to travel, as Kavakov was not member of the High Artists Union. He was a decorative drawing, Children's illustrator, was only member of the Union of Illustrators, and it was a big a part of the whole official, non-official game in these days was also about who was member of the real union, who would get the real commissions, and so that's. And artists like Kavakov, therefore, were kind of the officiality didn't like these artists who started to have success outside of Russia without being, and then it was really difficult to get people interested in his work. So the Western canon was so strict in these days that work like Kavakov's work didn't fit in at all.
This reception in Switzerland was the same.
There was more or less the same. It was like it was very few people understood what it was, and at the same time it was Jolles, and Jolles of course kind of had his connections to. I think Meyer Öri already bought in these days, and so on. Certain people did, but generally the public was a bizarre thing from the East, and that was it. That was not, this lasted for a certain time, and then was this exciting situation which of course was a part of Perestroika, to invite Kabakov. And so I got the city of Graz to invite him to come to Graz with a grant. And politically in these days it was possible to have I think it was the foreign minister and the prime minister, or even the president, who will sign the invitation or write letters with it. So it was possible at a very, very high political level.
Exchange.
Yeah, it was. And Austria was always privileged in its contacts because the Soviet Union wanted to show the good guy towards the neutral. It was an old political game, also relating to German unification and neutrality. Stalin offered Germany in the 50s, if Germany would become neutral, then unification would be possible. So the Austrian Treaty of Peace and Staatsvertrag was an example for the Germans, and in this succession, the Soviets treated Austria always with certain privilege. And in this tradition, I think Kabakov was also kind of a test balloon to, if it was possible to let these artists go to the West, and also a sign that Perestroika was something else.
So, what happened in 1989? If you say that Vienna itself strived on this anticipation of potential change?
Yeah, but actually the Viennese themselves, they didn't really notice. There were very few people only who understood these changes. And I have to add, it was a further step for me in '88 when I did a show in Graz, again at the festival and the Kunstverein, which was called Graz '88. And it was the first time that we would show young artists from Moscow to Los Angeles. And in the European context, in these days, still artists from Los Angeles were very, very rare. In the Los Angeles artists that I showed in the show were Mike Kelly and Lislana, and it was one of the first presences of both. For Lislana it was the first presence, and for Mike Kelly it was like, I think he had shown in Europe once before. So it was, but this generation was in Californian artists you would maybe see sometimes Jean Baldessari, but that was it. And the same with the Moscow artists. In this case, it was Konstantin Svestochotov and German Vinogradov. But it was also to show two Polish artists, or one Polish artist, Mirosław. No, it was not Wojtek Pawlak, and to show Stanislav Divish. These were situations which were pretty new.
And I think it's interesting also in terms of cities which you can define as off-centers. It was not anymore Cologne, New York, or London. It was suddenly Los Angeles, Vienna.
Yeah, and that was also very new.
And I think that's something new, no, which happened at that time.
No, because before it was New York and hardly any other place. Yeah, Cologne for a short time in the 80s, but also before it was like it was New York and not so much else. That's true. It's that was also the idea of the show. Actually, Helmut Sobernik, for the poster and for the catalog he cut city plans in stripes and glued them together.
Created a new one.
Yeah, from Moscow to Los Angeles. And that was and then it was the political move. It was very funny because Austria actually was overhauled by the whole political development, and it was primarily perceived as a commercial Gelegenheit.
Circumstance.
Yeah, not circumstance. Yeah, commercial opportunity, exactly. And it was the first serious sign that lots of things were changing. Was that I think it was not. I think it was in the fall of '88 that Hungary had changed some travel law, and there was a holiday shortly after, Hungarian holiday shortly after that, in November, and nobody expected in Austria suddenly all shops of Maria-Hilfer-Straße were flooded by Hungarians, about about 300 million shillings, or a huge sum of money was spent within a weekend for refrigerators and consumer articles at Marie-Hilfer-Straße. The shops didn't have anything anymore for Christmas. And as the Hungarian government oversaw it, that there was so much Western money in Hungarian pockets, which flooded into the market in Vienna. And this was kind of the first that people realized that something was happening. And it was a minor change of law within Hungary, which at these times the Hungarians were already traveling easier than other countries. The Czechoslovaks, and it was kind of these changes, and so on. The same happened with Czechoslovakia in '89 at a certain date, and the funny thing was seemingly less Western money was in Czech and Slovak pockets, because
that's why I don't recognize this Hungarian experience, because anytime I traveled after political change in '89, I was really looked at as if I was this beggar from the East who doesn't have money and is worth nothing. So
but the difference was, and that was for me so funny, because it was the same day that Franz West had his opening at the Kunsthistorische Museum, and the Kunsthistorische was flooded by visitors from Czechoslovakia. And it was the saying, like, the Czechs and the Slovaks, they come to the museums, and the Hungarians
I love this one. Very good.
Because Erhard Busek, who of course was the politician then, who of course was very fond about what happened, he was a politician who was extremely involved in the decades before in all these changes. He was immediately giving free entrance to museums for people coming out of these countries, etc., etc.
Really?
Yeah. And actually, I remember now that on a political level, it's like Erhard Busek, Kathrin Schwarzenberg, there were a few people who were very active and who also would communicate through the exile communities here with the countries, but there was not a broader interest in Austria for these questions, and Busek was quite an exotic figure. But I remember that it was much more. I kind of got a much more experienced friend of Martin Prinzhorn, Annette Labouré in Paris. She, a German woman in Paris who was working for the Ford Foundation and later on worked for Soros, who was heavily involved in all these things. But it was much more an international network than a specific Austrian one.
And it was not really mirrored in the institutions of art, no? It was really happening outside
it's not at all mirrored.
I
remember that I tried. There was a show in Bratislava, the show which came from the Russian Museum. This guy, what's his name? The one who is now in big troubles in Moscow. What's his name? The guy, not Andrei Yerofeev. No, this is the guy. There's this guy. There's this museum in Moscow, which was based that people like Kabakov and his generation mainly would give artwork for a future museum already in the early 80s.
Oh, I remember.
And this collection was exhibited in Bratislava.
In the National Gallery, no?
Not in the National, maybe in the National Gallery. I'm not sure now where it was.
No recollections.
And it was 1990.
1990.
And the thing was that I was there with Daniel Hackenberg together, and the people there were completely uninterested in it, because actually people who organized the show wanted to profit out of perestroika when they started to work on it, and when they started to work like in '88 on it, at a time when changes in Czechoslovakia were still not happening. And these people thought, as perestroika is happening in the Soviet Union, if they could import avant-garde from the Soviet Union, which of course the officials kind of, as it was coming from Moscow, everything was fine, but when the show was there, the Iron Curtain was away, so nobody was interested anymore in things that were coming from Moscow. But it was, in my eyes, one of the best shows of the Russian new avant-garde that I've seen ever, out of the quality of this collection. And actually Daniel and me, we were talking to the people who were looking at as guards on the show, and they were kind of pissed because it was avant-garde and they wouldn't understand it, and this kind of came from Russia, so they hated it. It was kind of this wrong show in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I tried to motivate journalists from Vienna
to go and write,
and nobody was interested. Even Mr. Schöllhammer in these days was not so much interested in that. And it was kind of, it was also around Christmas and so on, there was no reception of the shows in Vienna, because for the Westerners still Russian art was very far away. And it was kind of, it was a paradox situation that nobody would, it was...
We're 20 years further and that interest was not awoken yet, no? There's no... I cannot stop wondering when I speak to people at the academy, for example. They have zero contact to even Bratislava, that's 40 kilometers from here.
I remember when
there's no exchange. How is that possible?
There's a lot of reasons, and it was in many other places like this. It needed a certain... like the situation between Berlin and Poland.
Yes, I think it's a good example.
Berlin and Poland, until very shortly ago, did also not happen, and they're again so close. And it's now it's completely usual. I remember still when I was in the late 80s, it was also Poland was super interesting for me. Even also again before the Iron Curtain fell down, there was also the lucky coincidence that in these days you could get very cheap airline tickets with the Polish airlines. So it was worth going for an evening to Warsaw to buy again airline tickets.
Really?
So whenever I would fly to America, I would first fly to Warsaw with the rest of the ticket that I had, then spend at an opening, at something with friends in Warsaw an evening. The next morning go to the airport, buy a business class ticket for the price of a tourist ticket in Warsaw for America, and then fly back to Vienna, and then some days later do my trip to America and fly business to America. That was my usual way of traveling, because lots could sell tickets much cheaper, which were within the international change possible. So I was quite a few times in Poland, and so I knew this whole Polish situation very close, which of course was the most active one, with places like Vauxhall and the museum in Łódź.
It seems to be up to today.
Yeah, and because there was this, on the one hand, the suppression of the regime was never so strong, and they were allowing certain islands. And actually people from Vauxhall told me that this was... the regime considered Western art as relatively harmless, and so it was. They had freedoms. Interesting enough, they were not allowed to show art from other avant-garde art from other Eastern European countries. It was considered as more difficult, and which was a very interesting phenomenon when you traveled in these days. That the situations between the Eastern European countries were completely unknown to each other.
Yes.
And only the museum in Łódź had a little bit of Czech art, but that was it.
It's very little. I would say
until
it's until now.
No, I don't believe so. I think 1989 produced something called Eastern Central Europe. That from then on, for very many reasons, some of which were strategic, the regions started to operate together and started to learn of each other. You know what there is in the scene. But our interest was not to deal with Moscow, because we wanted to look at New York.
But if you look into the museum collections of East European museums, there this you don't see it. You know, you don't. They would have had a big chance also after '89 to collect avant-garde.
With the exception of two museums who really actively chose to be that. When you think of 2,000 plus collection in Ljubljana,
which came later.
Yes. Which came later, 2,000 plus.
And Łódź, of course, Łódź was
of course, that's kind of,
But we're speaking about the 90s. I think the years after 2000 is a little bit a different situation again. But in the 90s, you know it much better. But I don't think that the museum actively neither in Warsaw.
Therefore, also the situations were no, but they could not, and they had to reorient themselves. on the other hand, within the population, there was a certain sense. I still remember the story in '88 when I went from Prague to Warsaw. I went with a taxi to the airport, and the taxi driver was asking me where I was going to, and I told him that I was going to Warsaw. And then this guy said, and it was still in the time of martial law and kind of very low supply in Poland, and this guy said to me, I envy you that you go to Warsaw. And I said, come on, but the people are hungry there, and it's not so funny life, and like living conditions are better here. But then he said, yes, I was working for some years in Poland. In Poland, there's so much more freedom, and so much more openness, and so there was a certain awareness by some people, and then on the other hand, the absurd thing of leaving the extreme border controls, leaving Czechoslovakia, with very, very precise lists what things you were not allowed to bring away from Czechoslovakia, until somebody explained to me that the East Germans would go shopping in Czechoslovakia because they would have money but no goods. And in Czechoslovakia there was a lot of goods and a relatively broad supply, and which were also relatively cheap, and so it was this is no bathing tubs and
no bathing tubs.
It's like everything which you needed to furnish houses was kind of forbidden to export from Czechoslovakia. It's like this kind of very strange communication between these countries, which was fragmented. No, but come back to Poland and Berlin, and I was always interested in the Polish situation. Showed a lot of Polish artists, Mirosław Polka in the gallery, and then Krasinski in Basel, and Pavel Althammer. And I remember in these days none of the Berlin galleries that I was showing Berlin artists at the same time was interested in the show until
2000 years, no? Until it started only in the 0 years.
I don't know when Pavel Althammer first showed with Neuger Riemschneider, that was like suddenly then these things moved. But before now it's like completely normal that these people go to Poland. It was the same time that, of course, in the moment when Adam Szymczyk became curator in Basel and these things happened, suddenly the change was there. But as you said, it's relatively little time. And until the late 80s, this Iron Curtain was strict also from the other side. Also, in the 60s there was more transparency. You have to imagine people like Milan Kniszak and so on. They were internationally known. Also Krasinski in the early 70s did shows in Paris. And there were certain connections, but they were not connections within this kind of highbrow international community. It was locally, it was mainly France taking care through a Polish or Czech connection.
These are fascinating stories in a way, aren't they? Histories that are not quite written.
Yes, they also related to certain. There was another history which was the whole story of constructivist art, and again France with so Staszewski and people following, therefore also Krasinski following Staszewski, they would be in a network of constructivist art. And I know now there are Polish art dealers who are buying work back from Staszewski work back from German or Italian collections, who went in the 60s or 70s to these countries. So, but it was again not. It was in a different segment of the art world, and then kind of the big international, the museum segment of the late 70s and early 80s did not recognize anything outside, quasi beyond the Iron Curtain.
Which was also in the show Out of Action exhibition from MoCA, which traveled to Vienna in the 90s. It was also suddenly clear that what you are saying, that the situation in East Europe was not really taken into consideration, and it was not present in the show.
Also that was very curious to me because I remember, and that was going much further back. Mid-70s, I traveled the first time to the United States, and I met Chris Burden in So it was just after Documenta 77, and I met Chris Burden, and he told me that he went from Kassel to Prague to visit the artist Stemberer, yeah. And which Chris Burden adored as an artist, and he described to me, was very alienated by the border controls and how they confiscated newspapers from him and so on, but was super interested in Stemberer and was kind of very enthusiastic about his work. And Chris Burden being his close friend to Paul Schimmer, it's astonishing that Paul Schimmer did not.
But it was probably really this Cold War division, which is mentally also inscribed, specifically in this generation. And I think one answer of this situation was then the show in Ljubljana, Body and the East, which tried to show that also in East Europe there is artists who would have to be shown in this out-of-action exhibition.
You closed the gallery in 1993, am I?
1992, I think, yeah.
1992. And was it because this spirit of possibility in the private sphere came to the end, or?
No, it was mainly biographical decisions, and it was a bit about cultural politics in Vienna. That it's kind of the spirit to do something new and to do something as an outsider was gone, and the government artificially wanted to create many similar situations. That was kind of
by establishing institutions.
Not by establishing institutions, no, but more by sponsoring galleries and this was kind of for me something which was strange. But on the other hand, it was of course something which would bring Vienna forward. But personally, it was like this. It was the same time as there was a big crisis, which I survived, but which made it clear to me that I had to decide between kind of the first 10 years in a gallery. It was possible to have an artistic approach as well as a business-oriented approach. In parallel. And more than artistic approach, which was kind of supported by some business one had done. And as some of the artists became very successful, they of course were interested that the gallery would work business-wise much more efficient.
It became business.
Yeah, it became much more business, and especially during the crisis, I understood also much more about the business aspect. But I was not sure if it was really interesting for me to follow it, because then it would have been to continue the business for a very few artists only, and to give up the liberty of doing something else. And at the same time, it was also that was combined with this big interest in things happening in Eastern Europe, and also which in the end proved wrong, but this imagination that Prague could become a very interesting city. And,
which it has never.
No, which it has never, because it was spoiled.
Spoiled by?
Spoiled by extremely good conditions of exhibition spaces, more or less strong public institutions, and a lot of foreign attention. And very, strongly rivaling artist community, which never came...
never flourished.
Never flourished, and was also kind of... I remember when I was involved...
This is now like,
when I was involved, when Jerzy Sevcik was shortly head of the contemporary part of the National Gallery, it was there was not so much the sense of kind of covering a whole Czech situation. It was of very much segmented and very much focused on very few things which you would do as a gallerist, but which it was not the attitude of the museum. So that's still something which is missing in Prague, that the museum would cover. It's only Knížák has the same focus on some people that he is interested in, and so this kind of broader identity thing never has been there, and which of course in Poland, in this way, the museum in Łódź was very important, because the people in Łódź always understood to bring together different aspects of artistic life, and I think the important thing in Poland was that major different streams. For example, I think the quality of Krasinski is that he understood to bring together the serialist aspects of Tadeusz Kantor with the constructivist aspects of Staszewski. And that means that there was a communication between two very different groups. And then we have the whole figural group of people who was also there, and so there was much more about the communication of different ideas on art, of different groups of people who also, of course, the political movements in Poland were much more vital. So it means that I remember how critical some of the young artists were already in '88 or '89 about the Solidarność movement. At the time when Solidarność was still underground, they were kind of saying that it was not clear if Solidarność, or with Solidarność the church, was not worse than the communists. So they would kind of compare the different systems. They would also, of course, the regime, being much more liberal than in other situations, would allow more. And they saw, and we know today in Poland, that the church sometimes is much more rigid. And some of the more critical artists already anticipated that. Not to paint the image so much in black and white. So they were much more experienced to deal with different realities. And that was, Prague was never as conscious. And so I think that...
But does it also have to do that Prague became a very popular city to move, specifically for Americans, and it changed the city in a very short time drastically also? No?
Yeah, but
living condition changed, it became an expensive city. And
I think there is a number of different reasons, but what I sense from what you say is a disappointment, that there was a huge anticipation of a possibility coming from the scenes.
Everybody thought it would be Prague, the most important
city,
but
has not happened.
It was not.
How about Bratislava? I cannot not ask the question coming from there.
Yeah, but Bratislava was, I think for me, Bratislava came into focus when we met, and before it was, except for this one show, I was not really, I think I traveled there once or twice, but it was not, nothing which was...
no scene, no institutions that would take care. At about that time, you established Kunstverein.
No, Kunstverein had established already in the mid-80s.
Mid-80s.
And it was a part of part of this whole 80s program in Austria, that Austria would try to gain or regain structures, or more or less gain structures, which were compatible with Western European standards in dealing with art.
So it came as a political impulse from above, in a way?
No, also, in some ways also. It was I would compare the establishment of the Kunstverein in Graz, which was a political thing of a of a city politician who wanted to have a more membership-oriented basis for.
But that's 86.
This was 85, 86. It was the same time when in Vienna the secession started to become vital again, when Edelbert Köhler was founding the Friends of the Secession, which made it more public. So it was from the more authoritarian structures which used to be in Austria, suddenly more civil society structures started to enter the art situation. In Salzburg, the Kunstverein started suddenly to become more interesting. So there was contemporary art became more of a public issue in Austria. And at the same time, it was, of course, for us, the gallery. I would dream of like some attendances at the openings of the gallery were like there were sometimes up to 1,000 people coming for an opening. And it was it became such a big issue in Vienna, and it was a sign of a certain change. And
Peter, did you speak about contemporary art at that time already? Is this term contemporary art?
Yeah,
do you remember that it was really established term for?
It was the term. Actually, the term historically was established with the museum in Basel, Museum für Gegenwartskunst, and that was 82, I think. 82, they founded in Basel as a branch of the Kunstmuseum, the Museum für Gegenwartskunst.
But it was meant. What was the meaning of Gegenwartskunst at the time? Contemporary art, as what's happening now, right?
They did not want to say any more modern art, because it was the first time that you would differentiate between modern art and contemporary or Gegenwartskunst.
And would you say that a reason could be that modern art was in a crisis, so that something else was established?
It was different. It was also kind of, especially in a city like Basel, where you had such a strong modernism, and modernism was Picasso and was gay, and with somebody like Beuys, you came into conflict if this to put it in the same thing. And
you moved to.
But by the way, there's a very interesting essay that we published in the catalogue of the collection of Anton Herbert, of an American historian who kind of points out the dates of 68 and 89. They are ultimately linked to each other.
And in relation to.
Yeah, it's not in contemporary art, also within European history and so on. That you cannot think 68 without thinking 89, vice versa. And it's also, I think, important for it's like 68. You have the as we see it now, the crucial time of what's you see minimal art, concept art Povera in context to modernism. And 89, you have a whole new generation which is beyond that and which is somewhere else. And it was interesting for the collection of Anton Herbert, which goes between 68 and 89, and which is a historically super interesting couple of dates. And it was that was for me, brings me, it's like in this way again this Graz 88 show was revived in a very different way with a show in Basel, where I wanted to deal also again with 4 different situations, and this was very funny. It was for me the idea to show 4 artists I'm close to, and which was Ilya Kavakov, Michelangelo Pistoletto, Joseph Kossuth, and John Baldessari. A little bit this geographical model of 4 different parts of the world. And actually they decided that they would make an issue of their show together, the date of the 21st of August 1968, the occupation of Czechoslovakia by the Russians. And it was a very funny experience what happened, and especially the Pistoletto didn't care so much about it. His contribution was not so interesting. Kavakov made an incredible contribution for it, and which was like a diary and with all the press clippings and so on. Baldessari was thematicizing the cinema program of that day in Los Angeles and taking 4 films and splitting them in 4 screens, and which was incredible. It was The Planet of the Apes. It was there were certain films that are so specific for this
to show
day.
how the life elsewhere goes as usual.
And Kossuth was doing the names of all people who died in '68.
Was it Kossuth?
Kossuth, all names of all people who died in '68 or who were born in '68. And this was also kind of interesting installation, because the 2 centuries, kind of the ones who died then were definitely different centuries as the ones who were born.
But on a related mode, is it possible to articulate what is it that happened to Western contemporary art in 1989?
At the first moment, nothing happened.
Nothing.
It was not. It was a very slow process.
And in hindsight, what was the change? What
No,
constituted?
it was a part. I think it was a part of what already happened during the 80s. Before, it's kind of diversity, bigger diversity of artwork, and I don't see it as as the whole world changed. I remember that shortly after that I was also traveling to Africa, and now we have this whole Asian phenomenon. So it's like historically, I think the come down of the Iron Curtain does not only mean the exchange between Eastern and Western Europe, but it's also it changes the larger picture of a decentralized world. And it's like, for me, it's more and more interesting that the late avant-garde of modernism, it's like modernism has to do a lot with internationalism, and the late of the avant-garde of modernism, how on the one hand they were very exclusive, as I described at the beginning. On the other hand, they kind of defined a vocabulary which allows art to happen in many, many different frames and constellations. That's interesting me at the moment, especially in relation to Asian art and so on, how out of conceptualism a language could develop that really is something global, and I think this happened within the 80s and the 90s.
You mentioned end of the 80s in connection with your gallery work, the crisis in the art market. There was a crisis end of the 80s, but after 89 suddenly a new situation appeared. No, within
but it did
what
not
kind
relate.
Of impact did it had on
that did have no impact with the market. The market. On the one hand, we always see that art markets are cyclical markets, and how many other markets in the economy, and there was certain economical crises which affected parts of the art markets. There were some big collections at sale at the same time, and suddenly the art market was not so stable as it was, for example, during the last economical crisis. And so for a short time, there was a big boom before. The late 80s were a big boom for the art world, much smaller than it was nowadays, last 10 years, but still there was a big boom, and which also had its reasons. And this boom went too far, and so there was a certain crisis, and then during the 90s it again developed the way we know now.
Yet you mentioned about when we discussed the closure of the gallery in 92.
It was like I survived the crisis.
Yeah, but still you said that art became business at that moment.
Yeah.
Is it related to 89?
No. It's rather that it's more a cycle of 10 years, and if artists become successful, they need about 10 years to really be successful. And so if a gallery
Kathrin's water, because we force you talking for hours. But yesterday, Stephen Greener talked at the Academy, and there was a question how the situation changed for him as an artist. He spoke that as a young artist, they were very interesting to show the works in the gallery, just about showing, and then later on it was a completely different situation, and then he described it that everything is now under the umbrella of product. And this changed deeply also the conception of artists and so on.
It is like that the art market became so much stronger. As far as I remember it in my own biography, until the early 80s, there was an art market which was very few countries, an international art market which was very few countries in Western Europe and the east coast of the United States, so maybe only New York. And during the 80s, it was suddenly whole United States became a potential market, and since the 90s, it's the rest of the world. And it's now we are in a global market, and it's completely normal that you will see in a house in Shanghai a piece by Olafur Eliasson, and you will see a Chinese artist somewhere in Berlin, and so that's something. And so the volume has become much bigger.
You, after the gallery, so you worked independently.
I was for 2 years, about 2 or 3 years, I was doing kind of freelance work.
But then you went to Basel in 96?
And then I went, in 96 I went to Basel for the
And ever since you're in public sphere, right? Public institutions. Yeah. Is it conscious decision or things happened that way?
It happened that way and was interesting. It was, of course, Basel was the dream. Basel was the dream of whatever you could do as a curator.
Exactly.
And it was, and it gave me the chance to work again with a completely new generation of artists, which
you did remarkable shows there with this remarkable series of books.
And it was like really was really interesting how the artist had changed and what had happened.
Can you describe it somehow? How this change, or is it?
What was the change? I think it was kind of this. Was the beginning of a certain kind of global approach, and transcultural approach in the artwork, which still is not. It's like I think there's still a lot. Where it's interested, still a lot in transformation.
Up until today.
Yeah.
But the public sphere did allow you to deal with it differently than a commercial sphere, or?
Yeah, but the commercial sphere didn't interest me. That was something I had, and I had understood. Like, in the commercial sphere, you can seriously only share your life with one generation, and the public sphere allowed me a further generation, and the rest is business. In the commercial sphere, the rest is business. And there are rare artists, rare dealers who can do more than one generation. But I think that was the quality of somebody like Leo Castelli, that he did 2 generations. That he did the pop art generation and the conceptual generation. Because also, on the other hand, Konrad Fischer, he only did 1 generation. It was the conceptual generation, and that was it. And so if you are kind of this passionate gallerist, then it's you are more or less stuck with your generation. You do not have to need the same age, but it's one. And then you have the possibility to kind of to deal with it as business, but that's another aspect. And then for me, what was interesting in Basel was the community in a place which is such a kind of heavy loaded art community, and also the community, the whole community as this city, the Swiss cities have a very interesting model of civil society, and art being an important part of it, and etc. etc. And it's of course what one gets interested in is the institution, how an institution functions, how an institution creates memory, how an institution is more than an individual, and this also then in the end led to the Joanneum in Graz, which is also like how a big organization works and what it means for a local situation.
But that's in comparison to Kunsthalle in Basel. It's a gigantic, powerful organization.
I don't know if powerful. It's only big.
There are many museums under one umbrella. Different museums.
No? But what does this allow you that you couldn't do in Basel, you couldn't do in your commercial gallery? What kind of space does it open that's new?
No, it's not about. It's not about. It would be what big interest for this space was the interdisciplinary dialogue, which is not easy to do, but which
you believe is crucial for contemporary art?
Which is interesting, I think.
Not crucial, not a matter of survival.
It's also very much in the nowadays contemporary art is much more, one could say, open, also much more less strict, less formalistic, so it's easier to be applied in such fields than it would be if I would deal only with strict, serious abstract painting. It's the interest of an institution. It's the question how such bigger institutions function, what they mean to society. There was the very special vehicle or the situation to create within this larger entity of institutions a new building, the Kunsthaus, which is a quite unique and I think very 21st century exhibition space, which was a contrast for me. Basel is so much 20th century and modernist and white cube, and to create, and which was for me in the last 8 years big fun to kind of work with this different kind of space or idea of space. Yeah, it was it was also the question how to deal with more complex.
Thank you. It's very fancy.
Yeah.
But okay, so if contemporary art is more than product, what is it then? You said what can institution do for society? So the question, I guess, I'm trying to pose, if it does go beyond being just mere product, what else is it? What is its capacity? That's something we're now quite busy with, because besides looking at these fascinating histories, very recent histories of last 20 years, we want to speculate of what will come out of it in the future. So we're kind of trying to look
at the future. You never know.
That's you never know, but you can speculate.
Yeah, and you can
we also do not know. We also do not know what art is about, and art is about many things. And
what are those many things?
Yeah, it's like I think it depends on a lot of circumstances. If I look at to speak with Joseph Cousteau shortly, then art is the definition of art. And if I look, for example, I read an incredibly interesting book some years ago by a German sinologist about art and industrialization in China in the range of several thousand years. And this guy being able to give a completely different image what art is than any Western art historian would do it, and which made me understand things like Ai Weiwei and so much better than it would, so it's. I think that's also the challenge nowadays, that art, and it was in a small scale. that was for me to visit the first time the museum in Łódź, to be confronted with Eastern European and even would avoid the Eastern and only European version of modernism, because seeing the museum in Łódź, I had to realize that modernism in Western Europe is a re-import from the United States. So it's an American modernism. So it's and these kind of differences, this kind of like how art can be an indicator, can be seismograph of a lot of cultural and political things, but of course it carries also many other different meanings. And I think we will look more and more at these differences. And I believe also more and more that art certainly is about objects. And it is about the quality that objects can carry messages that other media cannot.
And which can get in
but it's a very, very kind of very diffused field. It's and I think in this way, at the moment we are in a big laboratory of how on a global level we communicate such messages and such meanings, and of course a lot of rubbish happens, but suddenly, but then on the other hand, suddenly it's possible for artists to communicate about along very, very big distances, and to bypass many cultural gaps.
And you don't share this sentiment that you hear recently that contemporary art is in desperate crisis.
Contemporary art always has to be in crisis.
It always has to be in crisis.
If it's not in crisis, something is wrong.
I
would rather question if it's not. I think it's not enough in crisis.
You think if it's in crisis, it's renew itself ongoing because it's in crisis?
Yeah, everything renews itself ongoing.
It's a capitalistic model, no? That you need the crisis in order to renew the system. You need it. You need this.
Yeah, it's now. Of course, crisis is defined in our system, and it's also a kind of a, I think, rhetoric way to approach certain changes. But and it's for me more provocative to say that art needs to be in crisis. We are facing huge political changes. We are facing huge economic changes. The world today is certainly a different one than the world, let's say, at the beginning of the 20th century, or in the 20s of the 20th century, or in the 50s of the 20th century was. And how can it be that it does not show in what's happening in art?
It does not show, in your opinion.
It shows,
it
absolutely,
does.
yeah.
Exactly, okay.
And so it has to be. It's like, but it's interesting. I think it's interesting how this functions in the. In this way, I would be interested at the moment to run a museum somewhere in a non-European context.
Non-Western or
non-Western, or it's like it's like how to develop, because the whole story what we were telling is about kind of standards. And when we started, like there was a modernist standard who was shared between Poland and Paris in the 30s, that was interrupted with the Cold War, first not only Cold War, which was through the Nazis, interrupted through the Nazis, and then split with the Cold War, and which now is, of course, not only a Western, but it's kind of a modern standard linked to a very specific political situation of the world. If you look at modernism in Africa and modernism in South America, I think it was also an interesting topic for many. Yeah. And now we have this kind of completely kind of open visual society in a certain way, which of course it's not only the political changes, but it's also these tremendous changes of media. If you have to imagine to deal with an image or to do a film or to do such things still 40 years ago, I remember when I was working as a young artist, it was a major problem to create a photograph which was larger than the tourist format of a photograph. And how today everyone can do it in every size, and it's not even expensive. The same is, which I see as a difficult thing for art, how easy it is to make video, film footage, whatever.
Is that where your renewed interest in object comes from?
Like kind of a more profound refinement. And I see it even in media art. I see the difference. I see the difference working with an artist like Sharon Lockhart and her precise way to do things, and many other works. So that's
okay.
It's it's again the question how strong you can, how complex you can create an object, or, and for me a film of, object is maybe the wrong word, but it's like, it's an artwork, and which can be a film, and it also can be a sculpture, it can be a conceptual piece, but it's, there are a lot of things. There are questions of fabrication, however they're done, certainly a part of it. And
so it
and
keeps the
it's
distinction
interesting
from
work.
the real.
And if it's a good work, it's this fabrication consciously is a part of
the way. Okay. Can I test one thing with you? And that's the question about politically engaged artistic practices of last 20 years, which became a commonplace, became a mainstream kind of, happening in the field of contemporary art. And it's something we also contributed to through a number of projects and exhibitions. Kathrin or I did, but more and more somehow I'm thinking of those politically engaged artistic practices of last 20 years being a mere, I'm going to use the word, propaganda for capitalism. In a way, like what socialist realism was to communism through affirmation, are many of these practices basically to capitalism through critique. And this idea, these artworks that critique contemporary capitalism, what to do with those? Because you have this circuit of being complicit to that system by critiquing it.
I think always if art gets too close to, if the circuit with political messages is too close, it becomes dangerous. But I want to say it in a different way. At the moment, I am really fascinated by a very different practice, and which I think is the outstanding political practice at the moment, is the one of IVV. And it's
and why is it? What constitutes it differently?
Because he's a political person and a political citizen, and he's mainly acting as a citizen, and sometimes it becomes also political art, and he's acting as an artist and not being able to ask to avoid politics, And of course, it's an extreme example, and it's difficult to be compared because of this very special biography. But but it shows how far somebody can go, and for me it makes politics extremely exciting at this level. And it does not only refer to politics, but I think there's also no role model, and the artists, and I think it's an artist like Günter Bruce for Austria in the late 60s and early 70s was super political. And it's, I think, beyond if an artist refers on politics, if he reports on politics, if he deals with politics, it's like how much, and that's always an option and it's not a must, he engages with his, and that does not mean to engage in a political party, but to engage as a person. And in this way, for me, political artists can be Josef Beuys or Martin Kippenberger as much as Günter Bruce or Ai Weiwei.
But all artists you're mentioning are living the political agenda. I think that's maybe something what these artists have in common, Ai Weiwei, as Kippenberger, as Bruce.
And they're very sharp minds, and not necessarily doing political art in the obvious sense.
But in political subjects in their life.
Yes.
I'm interested in members of whatever civil society is, or members of society, and but for me it depends on a person, and a person doesn't need to be political in my eyes, but if they are, I'm more interested in these complex strategies which are the ones to act in a overall political situation.
But then, so the position of Ai Weiwei or his practice you wouldn't see as a propaganda for the system? Through critiquing the system?
It's critiquing many systems. It's as critical on our Western approach as it's on the approach of the regime.
But you would not call it propaganda. That's something I suffer with.
Not at all propaganda. Definitely it's anti-propaganda.
Anti-propaganda.
And it's a very, very being very knowledgeable about which are the wounds to be touched and where.
Then maybe to conclude, also looking at my watch, you have to go. If to conclude and speculate, indeed, I know we don't want to read in the coffee what the future will be, not at all. But to speculate about what an interesting position of the contemporary would be. Ai Weiwei would be an example for you.
Definitely, because he's one of the artists who is bridging cultures, and who is like, and one who can mobilize a lot of different aspects and has a complex work.
Maybe also because he lived for a while in America, so he knows both systems, so that he can really shift and transgress. Yeah, transgress. And,
that's certainly that's one thing. And there's also this incredible biography, and which also makes him so political, and that's that he's not this. What you were saying before has also a lot to do with corruption. It's of course everybody, especially in the art world, easily is corruptible, and
through either market or
market
propaganda.
Institutions, careers, whatever. It's normal, and it's.
I don't want to see normal.
The interesting thing is how people are avoiding it and how people are dealing with it, and we.
Reflecting
and the political figures like Beuys or Kippenberger or West, they are dealing in a very idiosyncratic way with it, and therefore they interest us, and therefore I would consider them as political. There are others who kind of do not bother about it and accept this way and do other things much more interesting. But it's about withstanding corruption and still having a different look at it. And with IVV, it's like some weeks before he was he disappeared. He was invited to join at very high ranks the official party. And because he's of course a person who comes out of this group of people.
And he refused, no?
He refused.
Yes.
And he's a dissident who is kind of grew up in the contradictions of such a system, whose father was extremely high-ranking and who grew up in the camp and who kind of lived through this very special history of this country.
He lived in a kind of paradoxical space, or still, no, and can deal with it. I think this is interesting also regarding IVV. He was conscious about this paradox.
And he also knew them. He also knew the situation, how that art can have such an importance to society. Which I heard the story. I don't know if it's really true. That when Mao Zedong would write a poem, he first would call the father of IVV to read it to him. And like this guy for him was as the most prestigious poet, the expert on poetry. But the moment this guy wrote the one wrong text, he was sent to the camps with the whole family and cleaning toilets. But it's. But I think that also speaks that the world is not that in the artistic sphere you still can create a lot of meaning that is also able to. Yeah. It's not only consumer good, not only propaganda for a certain thing.
But there is another position possible.
These positions are possible.
But is it only possible in extreme circumstances, like China?
No, I think Martin Kippenberger or Franz West are similar cases.
But and of the younger generation today in the West?
For me, Pavel Altheimer, in his ways, as such, he is an political figure in his very own idiosyncratic way. Again, he is somebody who opposes the normal way to go, and who shows a different model, and is in a certain way honest to it.
And Peter, would you say also regarding IVV or maybe Pavel Altheimer that they still live the idea of autonomous art? That art has still an autonomous
the idea of autonomous art is a very European model of that is a very valuable model, but which, for example, in an Asian culture never existed in this way.
But art field as a status apart, being an artist as a status apart maybe, rather than autonomous art. Because you get into complex discussion of autonomous object that is not to be related to the art world, but to the world at large, etc. But status apart to go against the...
I think these are questions which are nowadays interesting to be discussed, and that there are different models, and which of course are in different cultures and in different political status. But I think...
there
was a Western model between, let's say, between the 15th or 16th century and the 20th century, which was a kind of very well-defined, refined model, which of course is not applicable even to European medieval art, and how come to African cultural practices, that's our difficulty with Africa. We do not have this kind of artistic traditions, because they're so differently defined or placed, plus in societies which go through so many changes.
That are unfamiliar to us.
And so that's. Well, I think it's interesting that art today seems to be a pretty good vehicle to to negotiate about these things. And it's not, at the moment, it's not music, or also maybe not theater, or not so much. It's like on the field of visual arts, it's maybe because I'm involved in it, but it seems that at the moment most of this global, transnational communication takes place. It's much less, it's a mass phenomenon. People are willing to engage in it, and people are willing to exchange about it. Although it's so different in forms and needs so many. I think that's interesting. And it's interesting how it was. Now, you may correct me, but I always had the impression that contemporary art was very much embraced in Eastern Europe at a certain moment, and it's incredible how much it's embraced in Asia.
And in the West.
Yeah, but it's also like in new situations, like situations that have changed.
The West, it has had a
tradition.
Yeah, and a continuation, and there is something started.
Shall we conclude here?
Yes.
Thank you so very
Thank you
much.
very
I found
much.
it fascinating.
Yes.
We could, if you,
Yeah,
had you
we
not
could
had your
make a second
appointment in a
part.
band.
We could make a second part.
And if you don't need more, so it's used now. For what is this used exactly?